Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Sengoku Jidai Part 2, The Siege of Inabayama Castle by Extra History. So this is the second episode in our series on the Sengoku Jidai. I had a good time with the first episode. We got flung right into this era of warring states. We're learning a lot of new names, people, places. I'm excited to see where the series goes from here. If you guys end up enjoying this video, I'd appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below, and we'll give you exclusive reaction content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Welcome back to the Sengoku Jidai. Last time we left off with Oda Nobunaga ascendant after his surprising victory over the Imagawa.
Yeah, and surprising, that's certainly a word for it. Oda was outnumbered by far. I think he had about 2,500 men to, I believe the Imagawa had more than 20,000, and he still managed a very impressive victory.
And young Tokugawa Ieyasu aligning himself and his clan with the victorious Oda.
Right, the leader of the Matsudaira clan, though as they said last time, he was sort of brought on as a junior partner to Oda.
Now we enter a period of consolidation, as Nobunaga tries to strengthen his holdings and plan for his own march on Kyoto. And this is where the alliance with Tokugawa becomes so important. You see, to the east of Owari, the home province of the Oda, were three great clans, the Hojo, the Takeda, and the Uesugi, all of whom were arguably more powerful than the Oda. So why didn't one of these clans march west and steamroll everything between them and Kyoto? Well, because every time one of them would start to, one of the others would invade their territory.
Right.
But now that Oda Nobunaga had the Tokugawa as allies...
And plus, even if, say, the Oda clan are less powerful than some of those clans to the east, proximity to Kyoto seems extremely important in this case, because like they said, if you're close by, then you can march on Kyoto and ideally still tend to your clan's affairs at home. But the further away you are, the further you have to go to get to the capital, the longer you have to string along your resources, the more you have to leave behind when you go, so their location is also really key in this situation.
His eastern flank was secure. He could look west with impunity, or at least with a pretty big buffer between him and anyone who wanted to stop him. So this just leaves two clans to the west between Oda and Kyoto. These were the Azai and the Saito. But remember, right now, Oda Nobunaga isn't grasping for the prize of Kyoto. He's trying to consolidate the gains he's just made. So he marries off his sister to the lord of the Azai, bringing them into the family, and hopefully ensuring their friendship. At the same time, he opens overtures with his father-in-law, the old daimyo of the Saito, Saito Dosan, a crafty ex-merchant who managed to raise himself up to ruling a whole province.
There are really a lot of connections going on between these clans. I mean, I'm not familiar with how the clan structure works. As I've said last time, I'm not that familiar with Japanese history, nor this period in particular. So I don't know how it functions, but it does seem in some ways similar to an aristocratic system where, you have control of your specific lands, you're fighting against your rivals, but at the same time, there are at least some familial relations, marrying off your daughters to the head of this clan or the son of the head of this clan, taking, the leader-to-be or the son of the leader of one clan hostage, your father-in-law runs this other clan, sort of an interesting system.
Saito Dosan is on the verge of making a deal with the Oda when he's trapped and killed by his own son, Saito Yoshitatsu, who then rejects Oda Nobunaga's overtures of peace. Looks like it.
Patricide, always brutal. But in political situations like these, not entirely uncommon.
It's back to war, then. And now it's time to bring in our third major actor, Toyotomi Hideyoshi.
Oh!
Actually, wait, no. Before we go on, we get...
Now, wait a minute. Last time they were dropping a lot of names that I'd never heard of, because I don't know about the history. But Hideyoshi, that's a name I do know, because we recently did the Admiral Yi series. And Hideyoshi played a pretty important role in that series. So this is someone who I do know. Finally, a name that I recognize. No, but it's interesting because, like I said, one of the reasons I wanted to do this series, of course, just to learn about Japanese history, but to sort of see what led up to the Japanese invasions of Korea, the Imjin War. That's something I was very curious about, and We're already getting a little bit of that pretty early on.
Gotta talk about names. Because, you see, at this point, Toyotomi Hideyoshi isn't actually being called Toyotomi Hideyoshi yet. And Tokugawa Ieyasu isn't called Tokugawa Ieyasu yet either. And basically everybody in this story changes their name like 13 times, because it seems to be a thing at the time to demand that everybody call you by increasingly cooler names the stronger you got, which, yeah, it's kind of awesome, but
it's pretty awesome. Plus, it makes sense. I mean, you can look at many kingdoms, empires, states throughout history. When you become king or become emperor, you usually take on a new title or a new name. I mean, a lot of countries, their kings just take on a new name when they take the office. You can look at the Roman Empire. Roman emperors loved taking on a selection of increasingly complicated names when they took the office. Now, this is not a kingship or an emperorship, but we're kind of running on a similar principle of this clan system. So when you gain a position, or you gain power, or you move up somehow, it makes sense that you might want to take on a different name. Now, this can be very confusing for historians. I mean, you can look at, for example, Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Throughout his life, he was called Octavian, Octavius, Augustus. To those who knew him, he was called something different. It gets very complicated. What do we call these people? What name do we use? Do we call them what they were called at the time? Do we use one name to keep it simple? And it looks like we're running into the same issue here.
It also gets extremely confusing, so we're basically just going to ignore it and just call everybody by the names history remembers them as.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. It's not necessarily the most accurate thing to do, but for the sake of not confusing the reader or viewer in this case, I think it's worth just using one or as few as possible names so everybody understands what's going on.
The really important one to remember is that Tokugawa Ieyasu was called Matsudaira Motoyasu,
right,
and like 6 other things before that, before he became Tokugawa Ieyasu. And that he was the leader of the Matsudaira clan from the last episode, which by the end of this episode he will rename to the Tokugawa... You see why I'm not bothering with all these name changes? Anyway, back to Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Here is a guy who really embodies the changing fortunes of the age. He began life as a peasant. When he was born, he wasn't even cool enough to get 2 names. But then he joined the Oda forces and became a sandal bearer. I kid you not, he was the guy whose job it was to carry Oda Nobunaga's shoes around. But
I mean, look, you gotta work your way up, my man. You can think of the feudal system in Europe. You become a squire, then maybe a knight, then, you work your way up. Everyone's gonna start from somewhere.
Apparently, he was really good at it. So good that he got promoted to being one of the guys who oversaw repairing castles. And from there, it was off to the...
And I'm willing to bet that the role of sandal carrier, or whatever the actual name for it is, included a lot more than just carrying sandals. I'm not familiar with Japanese history or culture, so I couldn't tell you, but I am willing to bet you that while he was fulfilling that role of carrying sandals, he was probably doing a lot more than just that, and I'm sure he made himself very useful.
Races. In 1561, Oda Nobunaga invades the Saito lands. For 3 years he's rebuffed, never quite able to take the mountain castle of Inabayama that the Saito use as their headquarters. But then Oda brings in Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Toyotomi's specialty was administration and diplomacy. He was a decent enough warrior, I guess, but that's not what Oda needed right now. If all it was going to take to beat the Saito was a good general and some courage, Oda Nobunaga would have gotten the job done himself already. So, instead of attacking the Saito head-on again, Toyotomi applies his special brand of skills. One by one, through bribes, appeals, and threats, Toyotomi turns almost all of Saito's retainers against them. With nearly all of their forces defecting, the Oda conquest of the Saito is a near certainty.
Hey, not bad at all. Look, when you're in an era of civil chaos, civil war, like this period, Sengoku Jidai, the era of warring states, sure, being powerful, having a large army, well-trained men, all of this is extremely, extremely important. But if we want to take cues from other great empires and states over time, what is equally as important is having good diplomacy, good politics. Sure, you need to be able to fight your way out of any situation that you're placed in, but it's also useful to be able to talk your way out or bribe your way out or make some sort of deal. This is also extremely important.
But there's still the impregnable fortress of Inabayama to deal with. So long as it stands, the Oda will never safely hold the land. They need a jumping-off point, a place to gather their troops and store their supplies, a place to safely maintain a siege from, and a place to retreat to if things go poorly. Their last several incursions fell apart because they lacked such a place. So Oda Nobunaga orders Toyotomi Hideyoshi to build one, right at the foot of Inabayama. Now, you would think that right under the arrows of the enemy, it would be impossible to build such a fortification. But not for Toyotomi Hideyoshi.
Okay.
According to legend, he built the place overnight. Now, we can be pretty sure that he didn't actually build that place overnight, but getting himself a legend like that probably means he built it pretty darn fast.
I mean, yeah, look, when you see legends like that, I mean, sometimes legends are entirely made up, but when we look at history and we have these legends, these legendary stories that are intertwined with the history, we can usually say, okay, that is definitely not true, but there's probably some truth to it. And so what we can glean from that is that no, he probably didn't actually build it overnight. Seems ridiculous, but he built it so quickly that it was very impressive to all around him. And that's why a legend like that would emerge. So, take everything with a grain of salt, but also be sure to find truth where there is truth.
He certainly did it fast enough that he got it built before the Saito could really muster an effective attack against it. As our story rolls forward, I think it's worth pondering why these three men with their particular talents were able to unify Japan when for 100 years all who came before them had failed. And the conquest of...
I mean, I know that Hideyoshi is going to be very important given the Admiral Yi series, and I could also guess that the other two were going to be important because they keep mentioning them and they've been a mainstay of the story, but the three that would unify Japan, that gives me a little bit more context.
Of the Saito gives us some good hints, I think. But back to Inabayama. Once Toyotomi Hideyoshi's fortress is in place, Oda Nobunaga brings his forces up to put the Saito's castle under siege. But Hideyoshi's not done. He has one more trick up his sleeve. He's been talking to the local villagers, and he knows of a path up the back of the mountain. A path that would let him and a small handful of men slip into the castle undetected. He tells Nobunaga of his plan, and they agree. He is to pick his men and head out.
It's interesting, in the Admiral Yi series, Hideyoshi was more of an antagonist. I won't say villain, because it wasn't necessarily framed in moral terms, but if Yi was the protagonist, Hideyoshi was one of the antagonists, fighting back. Although the corrupt Korean government was also an antagonist, but whatever. In this series, it's interesting to see our perspective is sort of flipped. Now Hideyoshi's a bit of a protagonist. He's an underdog. I like that a lot. He's come from the bottom, he's worked his way up, and now we're seeing his brilliance in action. We're saying, ooh, what's he gonna do next?
In the dead of night, they scale the side of the mountain, and just before dawn, leap over its walls. They quickly rush to set fire to the storehouses and the powder magazine. The magazine explodes in this great gout of flame. The defenders inside are totally disoriented. Outside the walls, they see thousands of men advancing on them. They see the treacherous banners of those they thought to be their allies slowly creeping up the hill, and then bang, the castle erupts. Some men throw down their weapons right on the spot. Others leave the castle walls and race to the courtyard, thinking a full-scale attack is going on. In the midst of this confusion, Toyotomi Hideyoshi and his small band of men seize the gate and throw open the doors. It's not long before the castle has fallen.
Nice.
This is the end of the Saito. When the campaign is done, Nobunaga makes Toyotomi a lord for his services and appoints him to rule over 3 prefectures of the former Saito's land.
How about that?
With the
He keeps moving up.
Saito out of the way, Oda Nobunaga plans at last to march to Kyoto. But how could he justify it? What legal reason did he have? If he simply marched in as a conqueror, it might unify other clans against him.
Interesting. So legalism was important to a certain extent. I'm learning more and more about this era of history as we go on. So, of course, we have this era of warring states, warlords, all that kind of stuff. But blatant conquest, though I'm sure it happened, was perhaps not acceptable, or could lead to other clans rising up and fighting back. So, being able to find some legitimacy to what you're doing, find some reason, especially a legal reason, would help you. That isn't incredibly surprising. I mean, once again, we can look at empires throughout history. Usurpers are generally not treated very well, especially if the current government is popular. But if you're a usurper who has some degree of legitimacy, has a reason, then you're much more likely to be accepted than a usurper who just rises up and takes power for your own purpose, or at least blatantly for your own purpose. Of course, most of these people who rise up and take power are doing it for themselves, but you want to mask that with some other reason.
Might even weaken the support of some of his retainers. But then, in 1568, a 31-year-old man turned up on his doorstep claiming to be Ashikaga Yoshiaki, displaced from Kyoto when his brother, the shogun, was murdered. This man asks Nobunaga to cast out the pretenders to the shogunate and reinstate him as the true and rightful shogun of Japan. What an opportunity.
There you go.
Nobunaga, with all the reverence and humility due to his station, says that of course he'll help. He wants nothing more than justice for Yoshiaki.
Of course, and that's about the best reason you could have. If you find some way to link yourself to the current government or the government that's been ousted, you can say, well, I'm just restoring things the way they were. I'm not the bad guy here. I'm just doing what needs to be done.
And to see the Ashikaga shogunate restored. Of course he'll help him retake Kyoto, fingers crossed. Then Nobunaga makes it known far and wide. He's marching to Kyoto to restore the shogun, and anybody who tries to stop him is acting against the rightful will of the shogun and will be destroyed.
Look at that. And now, he doesn't have to use his authority or his legitimacy. He can claim the rightful authority and legitimacy of the shogun. And there you go. That's exactly what I'm talking about when I say it's better to have legitimacy. Now you have a reason. And now, no matter how tenuous or misleading your reason is, when other clans look at you, they say, well, he does have a reason for doing it, even if we're not happy. There is some legitimacy there.
Not much you can say against that. And so, with a somewhat naive heir to the shogunate in tow, Oda's forces sweep west, smashing the few clans that stand in their way, and by the year's end, they're in Kyoto. And there we will leave our story for today. Everything's great, Oda has Kyoto, the, quote,
well, everything's great for Oda.
Rightful shogun has been restored, Hideyoshi is managing the Saito lands, and Ieyasu is holding down the fort in the east. What could possibly go wrong? Tune in a couple weeks to see what goes wrong.
What could possibly go wrong? Good question. I don't know. I'm very curious to see what does go wrong. Okay, so we have a march on the capital, on Kyoto, under new management. Though, of course, it was, according to Nobunaga, just a restoration of the old shogunate. What we really know is that he has now taken power. Very interesting. We also learned that these three men who keep coming up, Ieyasu, Nobunaga, and Hideyoshi, are three unifiers of Japan in some way or another. I'm very curious to see how that plays out throughout this series. I'm real interested to see the wider political ramifications. I mean, I like seeing the story, of course. I like seeing the battles, the sieges, all that kind of stuff. But what really interests me, as someone who doesn't know much about this period, is sort of the broader history, the wider political changes, the wider territorial changes, how this sets Japan up for the future. All that stuff I find really interesting. So yeah, another great episode. Once again, please leave a like, subscribe, and please leave comments down below if you have any further information to add. I always appreciate it when you guys fill in any gaps I have, or give me answers to questions I've asked. I really appreciate that, because a lot of you know more about this than I do, so thank you. So, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.